This week on The Other Side Australia, the connection between woke ideology of the left and the mishandling of COVID. A very special address by an Aussie academic at an international forum that will blow your mind. The Liberal Party shows that it's still too scared to stand up for true liberal values. A new study shows Aussie unis are letting young teachers and our kids down big time. Ben Shapiro shares his views on why so many in Western countries are feeling so much sympathy for Gaza and seem to have forgotten the horror of October 7. And a professor warns that we could be entering a kind of intellectual dark age following a frightening poll of young people on the topic of free speech. G'day Perth, g'day Newcastle, g'day Australia. This is episode 233 of The Other Side Australia for the weekend commencing Friday, November 24, 2023. And I'm Damien Coury. Well, there's been a lot of talk in the media this week about the Reserve Bank being likely to raise interest rates again in the coming months. I've said it before on this show, and I'll say it again. If you can't handle your home loan at interest rates of around 8 to 10%, it's time to talk to your financial advisor, because it might be worth selling before all hell breaks loose and everyone's trying to sell and prices drop. All this media speculation about further rate rises is pure theatre. There will be more interest rate rises, probably several of them. Inflation is nowhere near being under control and within the 2 to 3% range that the RBA aims to keep it at. Interest rates are the only tool the authorities have to really try to dampen demand for goods and services, to slow down our spending. And dampening demand is the only way to bring inflation down when you can't increase supply of goods and services. It's Economics 101 that we all should have been taught in high school but weren't because our education system is rubbish. Prices go up when demand exceeds supply. Prices go down when supply exceeds demand. When there's too much of something and nobody wants to buy it, the price goes down. We have high demand and no supply. Why do we have low supply? Because we've shot ourselves in the foot as a nation with COVID and net zero policy. We've murdered supply. There's no workers, there's no materials for building, energy prices are through the roof. So everything costs more to make. Everything is affected by those things. And red tape and green tape and COVID lockdowns have driven a lot of businesses to the wall. Australia's been run so badly by both Labor and Liberal parties for the past 20 years that we are stuck in this inflationary environment. It's sticky, as they like to say. So it's absolutely no shock at all that the minutes from the last Reserve Bank board meeting on Melbourne Cup Day, when they upped the rates for the 13th time, have indicated that they're prepared to keep raising them. The minutes were released this week and they say that the board members, quote, noted that the risk of not achieving the board's inflation target by the end of 2025 had increased. Members agreed that whether further tightening of monetary policy, that's just a fancy way of saying more interest rate rises, is required to ensure that inflation returns to target in a reasonable time frame, would depend on how the incoming data after the economic outlook and the evolving assessment of risks, blah, blah, blah. Look, this government has no plan to increase supply. Chris Bowen has no plan but to make our energy ridiculously expensive by pandering to the net zero zealots, both here and abroad. It's economic vandalism. Nobody, state or federal, has a plan to reduce the size of government, the number of bureaucrats, or their tax theft from the productive members of society for their insane overspending. And until we do those things, nothing is going to change. And nobody is going to do those things until we, the Australian people, collectively demand it. But since most people aren't even aware of how the economy works, how much debt we're in, how much the government is spending, and how out of control our bureaucracy is, it's unlikely anyone will be demanding anything soon except even more spending on subsidies and welfare and even more government jobs and public servants. The last politician in Australia who had the guts to try to cut back the public service was Campbell Newman as Queensland Premier between 2012 and 2015. The financial ratings agency, Standard & Poor's, applauded the move at the time. Without it, Queensland may have lost its high credit rating. It was the politically unpopular but right and responsible thing to do. And when politicians cut spending and do the right thing in Australia, what do? We listen to Labor and the unions squeal. Evil right-wing bastards are sacking poor public servants. And we slam them for it. Is it any wonder nobody tries to cut spending and do the right thing? Is it any wonder we're running massive state and federal debt and all the major political parties keep on spending? And in the Sunshine State, they are still hammering Campbell Newman for what he did 8 years ago. He hasn't been in power for 8 years. Yet the Queensland Labor Party are still trying to scare the electorate with the message that the LNP will cut the public service. Never mind that somebody should actually cut the public service. Never mind that the 12,000 jobs Campbell Newman cut were cut without any forced redundancies. And never mind that they've now been replaced more than 3 times over since Labor came to power in 2015. You heard me. 45,000 more public servants in the Sunshine State today than in 2015 when Anastasia Palaszczuk took over. Labor and the Greens and the unions are all about bigger and bigger government. So they will never cut back the bureaucracy because they live off it. So instead of defending Newman's legacy, the LNP in Queensland have spent 8 years desperately trying to distance themselves from him. And this is problematic because while critics say that Mr. Newman moved too far too fast with his reforms, and others say his style wasn't collaborative enough, that he was too combative, Newman is the only Liberal or National who's ever won government in Queensland in the past 25 years. Instead of reminding people that Newman took the hard road and tried to do the right thing, they keep trying to reassure people that they won't ever try to cut the public service again. I personally don't think the Liberal Party will consistently win state elections in Australia ever again. They now only rule in Tasmania until they find a backbone and stand up for traditional Liberal values, especially the very important value of small government and the value of supporting small business. They'll win the odd election here and there where the Labor Party have been in power for a long time and everyone's just fed up with them. But they won't rule the roost nationally until they define what they stand for and stick to it. In Queensland, the LNP and the opposition leader there, David Crisafulli, is betting on the Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk just simply losing. And understandably, he's trying to just make sure nobody gets upset between now and next November's election. So this week, he made it clear that he won't be reducing the size of government to help rein in the state's ridiculous forecast $147 billion debt by 2026. Here's how Channel 7 Brisbane reported that.
He says he wants to grow the public service and restore integrity.
Build the best homegrown public service in the country.
Committing to
no forced redundancies.
Well, that's not new. Crisafulli has told Queensland's 250,000 public servants that big government is going nowhere. He said the Newman-era sackings didn't work. Well, they were never given a chance to work because they were all reversed by Labor pretty quick smart. He said that the move by Newman saw the party punished by Queenslanders and would not be repeated by a government he led. Now, speaking as a classical Liberal and a man of principle, this makes me very angry. But as a pragmatist and a person with 35 years experience in media and PR, I do sympathise a bit with Crisafulli's approach. We know that Liberal Party leaders who say they'll act like Labor when they get into government inevitably lose. That's been proven time and time again in the past 3 years in every state and territory bar one. The difference in Queensland now is that COVID is over and Palaszczuk is widely disliked. So Crisafulli's strategy makes short-term political sense. Just say what you need to say to win the damn election. Don't rock the boat, don't upset the public servants or the unions for God's sake, and keep your powder dry. The problem for Crisafulli is this. It's highly unlikely that Anastasia Palaszczuk is going to be the one leading Labor into the next election, given how on the nose she is with the electorate. A recent Courier Mail poll had 93% of people saying they don't think she can win. Labor just has to find a shining star. That could be a problem, by the way, since their front bench is hardly flush with high performers. But if they do manage to find a shining star somewhere, then Crisafulli's Labor Light strategy will most likely backfire, as it did for every other Liberal leader who's tried the same routine in the past 3 years. Queenslanders, like every other state in Australia, will face an election with two political parties that offer them a choice between big government on the one hand or big government on the other hand. And faced with that choice, they'll probably just stick with the mob that they know is used to managing big government, Labor, especially if there's a fresh face at the helm that isn't Anastasia Palaszczuk. On another note that speaks to an Australia-wide governance problem, Mr. Crisafulli said in his speech this week that he wants to create a truly independent public service so that public servants don't feel like they have to do what ministers want politically, but can do what they believe is truly right. The Courier Mail reports that this follows a review in 2022 into culture and accountability in the public service, which noted that bureaucrats often, quote, feel pressured to produce advice fitting with the preferences of the minister. Now, let's just take a reality check for a moment. What is this nonsense notion of an independent public service? As if the public service shouldn't be accountable to the government leaders elected by us, the people? This is an Orwellian garbage concept invented by public service bureaucrats and lawyers for the benefit of public service bureaucrats and lawyers to secure and increase their power. It's an idea that we, the people, need to stomp on fast and hard if we care about democracy. Bureaucrats should feel pressured to follow and be guided by the preferences of the minister, because the minister represents us, the people of Australia, and was elected by us to set the agenda and take responsibility. The public service should never be independent. It should do as it is told by the people it exists to serve, and whose tax money continues to fund it, I might remind them. So I don't want a public service that isn't accountable to the politicians we elect to represent us, thanks. Like any business or normal organisation, public servants need to do what their leaders want. And in the case of government, their leaders are us, and the ministers and MPs and politicians who represent us. If those efforts fail, then the political leaders take the fall at the hands of the people at the next election. That's how it works. Policy must come from the ministers elected by us. Sure, I mean, the Directors General and other bureaucrats can advise, recommend, encourage what's right, but the idea that ministers should be removed from influencing advice and decisions and directly leading policy decisions and execution is absolutely crazy. And the nutty idea that this is somehow more moral or ethical is absurd. Let's keep the politicians out of government, say the bureaucrats. Yeah, right. So you don't have to be accountable to the people. Nice one. Reminds me of Sir Humphrey and Bernard, the bureaucrats in the brilliant old British TV comedy of the 1980s, Yes, Prime Minister.
If the right people don't have power, do you know what happens? The wrong people get it. Politicians, councillors, ordinary voters.
But aren't they supposed to in a democracy?
This is a British democracy, Doctor.
How do you mean?
British democracy recognises that you need a system to protect the important things of life and keep them out of the hands of the barbarians. Gosh. We run a civilised, aristocratic government machine tempered by occasional general elections. Since 1832, we have been gradually excluding the voter from government. Now, we've got them to a point where they just vote once every 5 years for which bunch of buffoons will try to interfere with our policies, and you are happy to see all that thrown away.
Yes, Prime Minister. They don't write comedy like that anymore. Look, if public servants are immune from taking direction from ministers and the direct intervention by ministers in day-to-day affairs, then we live in a technocratic, bureaucratic state, not a democracy. Politicians are there to represent us. Remove them from that job, and what are they really there for? We may as well be an authoritarian dictatorship run by senior public servants, which I fear we virtually already are. Now, Argentina is a country that Australia could learn a lot from. They were rich in natural resources and beauty, still are. It was once a wealthy, industrialised nation, but it's been in economic and social decline thanks to socialism for decades. And the people have finally had enough. This week they elected a new and very different president. They've woken up, very, very slowly, to the same old socialist lies that the government can take care of you, that the government can give you free stuff endlessly, and that if they do this, then the economy, well, it'll be just fine. Unlike half of the Victorians in Australia, and I apologise to the other half, it's not your fault, Argentinians actually get the lies now. They realise it's easy for left-wing politicians and socialists to sound nice and compassionate and kind, but that their long-term thinking and their ability to run things is a train wreck, and that all they're really doing is selling out our kids by racking up debt that our children will have to pay off. The Economist magazine explains Argentina's decline like this.
The main reason Argentina's economy is so chaotic is because of consistent economic mismanagement over decades.
Countries like Britain have experienced annual price rises on par with the world average, in high single digits. Argentina's inflation hasn't been that low in decades. The rate has been higher than 100% for almost all of 2023.
Right now, only Venezuela and Lebanon have higher rates. And it's really hard to kind of just imagine what that's like. For some people, they just can't make ends meet anymore.
And as a result of that, Argentinians save their money in US dollars instead of the local currency. But of course, the government limits how many US dollars you can buy. $200 per month is the current legal limit, which everybody simply ignores.
That has created a vast black market for currency. Dealers line the streets of the city centre, while people hoard stashes of cash at home.
The main reason Argentina's economy is where it is today is historical.
Once one of the richest countries in the world, there are many reasons behind Argentina's decline, including the legacy of this man, Juan Domingo Perón, elected president in 1946.
He came to power after having been inspired by Mussolini's fascist Italy. Basically, what he took from fascism was a strong state that's very intrusive, and a strong emphasis on nationalism. And he combined that with also having a very strong labor movement.
He introduced the 8-hour workday, increased wages for the poor, and created vast, expensive welfare schemes. He also embraced economic isolationism.
The emphasis on national sovereignty led to kind of the coddling of workers by protecting them from foreign competition that has shut itself off from international trade.
Perón is long gone. Don't cry for me, Argentina. But his legacy lives on. Peronists have been in power for 16 of the years since 2003. Argentina is rich in soybeans, in lithium, and in copper. But the government heavily regulates international trade. And the government spends like crazy, borrowing like crazy to do so. What does it spend on? Mainly giving massive price subsidies to people so they don't revolt. Subsidies on things like electricity. Sounds familiar. In Europe, electricity costs the average person about $40 a month. In Argentina, it's only $5. The government, the taxpayers and the lenders to the country pick up the rest. Even worse, 1 in 3 people is employed by the state. On top of that, there's massive welfare spending.
A lot of spending goes on paying salaries and pensions. You actually want it to go on things like investment, technology, infrastructure, helping the poor, rather than paying public wages. Governments have become dependent on the central bank printing money to basically finance spending. And the more money you print, the worse inflation gets.
Yet again, another country that proves socialism does not work. And remember how rich it was before Perón. Just like Australia, it can happen here if we don't wake up. But Argentinians have woken up, it seems. A political outsider called Javier Milei has pulled off a massive upset this week with a huge win in Argentina's presidential election, gaining 56% of the vote. Milei is a 53-year-old economist with wild hair and thick sideburns, and his main platform has been to get rid of the local currency and replace it with the US dollar. More on him in a moment. Argentina funds all of its crazy spending with money it borrows from the International Monetary Fund. Nobody else will give it any money because it's defaulted on too many loans in the past. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is the major financial agency of the United Nations. It's funded by the UN's 190 member countries, including Australia. And normally the IMF requires countries that it lends to mend their ways. But the requirements placed on Argentina have been very, very lenient over the years. Argentina owes the IMF more than any other country on earth, and more than double what the number 2 borrower owes. That's Egypt, by the way. In fact, Argentina accounts for 1/3 of the IMF's total debt. And in Argentina itself, there's lots of crazy taxes on the very few wealthy people left, as bureaucrats and governments try desperately to keep the whole game going.
If you want to organize a concert in Argentina and bring a British singer, you have to pay the official dollar and then an extra tax. We call it the dollar Coldplay. If you want to travel abroad, you use your Argentine credit card and you pay the official dollar plus taxes. And we call that the dollar Qatar. This idea of having 10, 15, 20 different prices for the same thing doesn't make any sense. That's a distortion. With the set of distortions, it's impossible that Argentina grows.
The real heart of the problem is trust. If Argentina cannot win back the trust of its citizens or the trust of the markets, it's never going to be able to fix its problem. And in order to build trust, you need to have good policies for decades, not just for a few years, not just for one government.
Yep, it's going to take decades to undo the mess, and there's going to be a lot of pain before there's any progress. So the new president will need massive support and patience from the people. And he doesn't have a big political party, so he doesn't have control of the main parliament or the Senate. The country is so welfare dependent that it's really hard to see how Javier Milei can fix things. But his incredibly rapid rise to power shows the people are ready for a new approach.
With more than 40% of Argentines living in poverty, there is a new kid on the block who doesn't look or speak like any other politician. And he's leading the race to become Argentina's next president.
Yo filosóficamente soy anarcocapitalista. El Estado es el enemigo, es una organización criminal.
Milei's message is reaching voters fed up with the usual politics.
La gente está cagada de hambre acá. No es porque vivamos en la villa no tengamos hambre, no, sí hay hambre.
Walter fixes bicycles for a living, but still relies on government-funded free meals, water and electricity to survive. Javier Milei wants to upend the country's politics and promises to make Argentina great again.
Argentina, en 15 años, podría estar alcanzando niveles de vida similares a los que tiene Italia o Francia. Y si me dan 35, Estados Unidos.
His supporters love his chainsaw gimmick. He wants to send a message that he will rip through the status quo.
That report from the UK's Channel 4 a few weeks before the election. So who is Javier Milei and why is he waving a chainsaw around? Tucker Carlson explained when he went to Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires, to interview the man in September.
He's a former soccer star, a goalie, a performer in a Rolling Stones cover band, and a libertarian economist. He's not a libertarian in the traditional American sense. He wouldn't fit into the Cato Institute, which has attacked him for liking Donald Trump too much. He's a libertarian in the traditional sense. He believes people should have the maximum amount of freedom they can be given, which is a lot, much more than they now get in Argentina. He has moved from basically nowhere in the last several years to become maybe the most famous person in this country. The reception he's gotten from the press in the West, particularly in the United States, the New York Times, the Washington Post, also the Financial Times, has been hostile To put it mildly, they describe him as a far-right figure, like he's a Nazi.
Just like our media do. Do you see a trend here? Tucker spoke to him at length to get the truth. Here's some of the interview, which is available in full on X.
Argentina is a country that has embraced socialist ideas for the last 100 years. So liberalism is a natural form of rebellion against the system. And rebellion is always led by youth. When they look at me, they see someone talking about liberalism and rebelling against the status quo. The issue is that Argentina began to embrace socialist ideas over 100 years ago. The analogy of frogs in a pot of water is useful here. When you turn up the heat slowly, the frogs don't realise it until the time comes, and when they try to jump out, it's too late, and they end up dead. Argentina's embrace of socialist ideas began with an idea that seems attractive, but is actually a terrifying way to operate an economic system. The idea that where there is a need, there is a right. It's a problem because there can be infinite needs, but someone always has to pay for those rights. And the resources for that are finite. That sparks a conflict between infinite needs and finite resources. In the liberalist view, this conflict is easy to resolve through economic freedom and private property. This is a natural mechanism to resolve this tension in a society. But the socialists don't much like the invisible hand. They prefer the claws of the state. And they hide it behind the discourse of social justice. This sort of social justice is deeply unjust because it's premeditated by unequal treatment under the law and preceded by a robbery.
Wow, that is a straight talker telling it like it is. Are you listening, Peter Dutton? It works. Javier Milei won the election last Sunday.
A seismic political shift is underway here in Argentina as the far-right, radical, outsider and unknown political force Javier Milei has become elected president.
Whoa, that's France's state broadcaster, France 24, or France 24's English service there, showing a leftist bias that'd make even Pascal blush. Far-right, radical, outsider and unknown political force? Actually, he's a typical classical liberal, libertarian, conservative populist. Nothing too unknown or radical at all. This reporter didn't mention the words socialism or Peronism. I guess because socialism has worked so well in Argentina.
The economy is struggling at the moment with inflation running at 140%, and it means that 40% of the population is living below the poverty line. He only became a politician 2 years ago, and now as a populist he's promising radical reforms. As a result, he's being compared to Trump in the US and Bolsonaro in Brazil. He wants to adopt the dollar as the official currency of Argentina. He also wants to close down the central bank and slash public funding.
Milei is set to take office on December the 10th. Political analysts say it's going to be very hard for him to implement his ideas since his party is new and he doesn't have control of the country's House of Representatives. They call it the Chamber of Deputies, or the Senate. Also, as soon as he starts bringing in responsible economic reforms, there's going to be pain for the people who've become so dependent on the welfare state. So he may not be able to do very much. The lesson for us here in Australia, don't get into an Argentina-type mess in the first place. Reject all forms of socialism and beware of politicians who say that the government will pay for things and make stuff free. Nothing is free. Either you pay or the taxpayer pays for you. And if we make taxpayers pay too much, they'll stop bothering to earn and stop paying tax. It's not rocket science. We reported on the show 2 weeks ago about how Chinese naval ships had reportedly collided with Philippine Navy vessels in the South China Sea around the Spratly Islands, in a territory that the Philippines says belongs to them, but which China still says belongs to it. That led to Joe Biden having to warn China that any conflict with the Philippines would invoke that country's treaty with the US. This week we saw another provocative incident from the Chinese Navy, this time against an Australian Navy vessel inside Japan's waters, where the HMAS Toowoomba had been operating. 2 divers who were in the water doing repairs on the HMAS Toowoomba were injured by a sonar blast from a Chinese vessel that came too close to them. Chinese officials accused the Prime Minister of making rude and irresponsible accusations towards China. The Chinese vessel kept a safe distance from the Australian vessel and didn't conduct any activity that could affect the Australian side's diving operations, an official Chinese statement said. China's Foreign Affairs Ministry accused Australia of making trouble in front of China's doorsteps. Mr. Albanese wouldn't say whether he raised the matter during his meeting with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the APEC summit last week in San Francisco. I don't talk about private meetings I have with any world leader. That's how you keep communications open, he said. But he did say that the government raised the issue in the appropriate way and very clearly. He said, quote, "It was unsafe and unprofessional from the Chinese forces." Opposition leader Peter Dutton was not impressed with the government's handling of the matter, saying China's denial that it broke international laws by getting too close to the Australian divers that it didn't break any laws in getting too close to the Australian divers was propaganda, and our country should be calling it out.
Where you've got Australian Navy personnel suffering injuries because of the act of the Chinese Navy, that is a time when the Prime Minister needs to pick the phone up, or in this case, fortuitously, he met with President Xi in person, and the Prime Minister's spoken about a lengthy conversation he had with Prime Minister Xi. He's spoken about other issues that he's raised, and now he says, oh, well, I can't tell you what was discussed with the Chinese president, but that goes completely at odds with what he said the day before. So I just think, again, the Prime Minister needs to be open and honest. He got himself into all sorts of trouble over the Voice because he was speaking out of both sides of his mouth, and I just don't think on this issue the Prime Minister can get away with cute language. Be upfront and honest and open with the Australian people and call out what is a very dangerous act that could have severely injured one of our Navy personnel. And if the Prime Minister is not prepared to stand up and show that strength of leadership at a time like this, I'm just not sure when he ever will.
That's Opposition Leader Peter Dutton speaking on Channel 7's Sunrise program this week. Well, the Israel-Palestine conflict is a headache, isn't it? Israel doesn't have an unblemished record in handling things well, but it's pretty hard dealing in a spirit of goodwill with a bunch of people who just want you wiped off the map. Nonetheless, a hostage deal was done this week. 50 hostages to be released by Hamas in return for 150 Palestinian women and children released from Israeli jails, and an influx of humanitarian aid into Gaza during a 4-day ceasefire. A lot of people have issues with Israel's past behaviour, some of it justified, but I've truly tried to look back at the history and actions on both sides, and I just cannot see the case against Israel being anywhere near as strong as the case for Israel. I've also been very disturbed by the way in the West support for Palestine has become entangled with left-wing politics. The news this week that high school students in Victoria had a day off for strike action in support of Palestine truly stunned me. And there's no justification for the pro-Palestine protesters that are blockading Israeli shipping companies at ports here in Australia. Zero. We've seen massive marches in Sydney and Melbourne and in Brisbane, and radical Islamists at a community centre in Sydney calling for jihad against our own government. We've seen pro-Palestine protesters led and encouraged by far-left socialist groups protesting near a synagogue in Australia's biggest Jewish suburb, Caulfield in Melbourne, leading to violence and arrests on the streets. We explored the implications of the conflict for Australia on the show last week. And it's of course available for you to watch any time that you want to watch it here on ADH. This week I just want to make the point that we in the West need to be careful that we don't falsely believe ourselves and our countries to be perfectly safe and unconquerable. We are not. I worry that we've been lulled into the kind of false sense of security that brings down empires and causes seismic historical shifts. Let's just recap on how we got here, shall we? Ben Shapiro did a little reminder summary for us on his Daily Wire show this week, and I want to play a bit of it for you. Now, Ben is obviously very pro-Israel and is a very devout Jew, but his recap of events is worth remembering.
The story of the current Israel-Hamas conflict happens to be extremely simple. Hamas is a genocidal Jew-hating organization that openly seeks the extermination of Israel. This makes it only the latest and most radical iteration of a radical Muslim movement that has sought Israel's destruction since long before Israel was even born. That mission has not waned in the 76 years of modern Israel's existence. Unfortunately, that mission also happens to be the passionate belief of a vast majority of Muslims living in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Israel, by contrast, is a democracy, the world's only Jewish state, and has repeatedly sought to make land for peace deals with Arab countries and organizations. Those concessions have brought Israel no friends in the West Bank or Gaza Strip. Far from it. Concessions have generally emboldened Israel's enemies. That's exactly what happened in the Gaza Strip. In 2005, Israel pulled out of Gaza in an attempt to stop the costs in blood and treasure associated with policing the area. All Jewish assets in the Gaza Strip were promptly destroyed by Palestinian Arabs. Elections were then held in the Gaza Strip, and Hamas was elected. To lead the Gaza Strip, they promptly consolidated their control by killing members of the Palestinian Authority. They then stole as much international aid as they could to build rockets and terror infrastructure, ignoring the needs of their population entirely. And then they launched repeated rocket attacks on Israeli civilians. For the last 2.5 years or so, as Hamas itself says, the organization attempted to deceive Israel into believing it had been deterred from large-scale terrorist action. Then, on October 7th, Simchat Torah, the happiest day in the Jewish calendar, at least 1,500 Hamas terrorists and many civilian fellow travelers crossed the Israeli border by breaching the border wall around Gaza and killed some 1,200 Israelis in their beds at a music festival and elsewhere. They raped women, then murdered them or dragged them in captivity back to Gaza. They kidnapped or slaughtered babies. Here is video from the Gaza Strip as members of Hamas arrived back in the Strip with their captives. If you can't see this is enormous crowds of people cheering and celebrating, excited at the slaughter of civilians and the kidnapping of other civilians. Does this look like a peaceful population? A population seeking peace and coexistence? Look at the excitement, look at the celebration. People screaming Allahu Akbar as hostages are driven away, including the bodies of people being beaten in the streets.
I toyed with the idea of showing some of the really graphic stuff today because I don't think a lot of Australians, and sadly many on the right side of politics, realise this is probably not the time to be airing our issues with the Jewish people or Israel-Palestine history more generally. In this war that's happening right now, Israel is us. You can have all the views you want about the past, but today, right now, Hamas represents the psychopathic lunacy of Islamic Jihad, which is madness we must never tolerate for 1 second anywhere in the West. It's a madness that is the scourge of the Muslim world, and it's telling that no rich Arab states are rushing to help the Gazans with offers of refugee status, rescue ships or planes, fundings for refugee camps. They don't want Islamic Jihad, and they don't want the troubles that they feel that Palestinian refugees from Gaza will bring to their own nations. In this war, Israel is the proxy for us, the West, and we better pray to God that they are able to eliminate Hamas and that they can restore order and peace in Gaza after the war.
Gaza and the West Bank are not filled with moderate Muslims. Far from it. Gaza and the West Bank are filled with people who despise the state of Israel and agree wholeheartedly with Hamas's genocidal aims. This is, in essence, the entire problem. Were these areas filled with moderate Muslims, Israel might find a peace partner. That peace partner does not exist. As a new poll from the Arab World for Research and Development shows, 75% of those polled in the Gaza Strip and West Bank supported the October 7th massacre. 76% support Hamas. 98% have a negative view of America. 78% believe in the total extermination of Israel altogether. As the old saw goes, if the Palestinians were to put down their arms tomorrow, they would have a state. If Israel were to put down its arms tomorrow, all the Jews would be dead.
And that's the reality. Now, the Labor government, Albanese's government, and Penny Wong, the foreign minister, has this week announced that 860 visas are being given to Palestinian refugees to come and live and settle in Australia, at least temporarily and possibly with a view to permanent residency. And that's perfectly fine if we thoroughly screen these people and make sure that none of them have ever had a connection with Hamas or any interest in Hamas, and that they are not sympathisers with Hamas. I'm particularly fed up with seeing people posting on social media that Israel is committing genocide. That is the greatest case of gaslighting I've ever seen in my life. And that's really saying something these days. People are literally walking down the streets of most major cities in the West, chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free," including school students, by the way, who should be at school and respecting the money that taxpayers spend providing their education. I'd fine a lot of them $100 each. That'd shut them up pretty quickly. Or make them have their protests on a Saturday or a Sunday. But these people that are running around chanting "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free," know full well that means the complete eradication of Israel and the Jews. That would be genocide. And by the way, as far as Islamic jihadi ideology is concerned, that extends to all of us in the West. Christians, atheists, right-wingers, left-wingers, centrists. The ideology wants Islamist theocracy and Sharia law in our governments, and it wants us out of the scene completely. It does not want peace, and it sure isn't into feminism or LGBTQ2AI++ rights. Little woke kiddies marching in the streets. To be clear, I'm speaking about Islamic jihadi ideology, which is real and way too prevalent. I'm not speaking about Islam generally or Muslim people generally. And by the way, if Israel did want to commit genocide against the people of Palestine, it could have done it 10 times over by now. They've had the might and the capability for decades. So please just stop it. This is not genocide, this is war. And war kills people, which is why in Western society we try to avoid it. We don't cheer it on. So if you're feeling confused, Ben has a theory as to why.
So, if the conflict is that clear-cut, why does it seem so complex? The answer is a strategy undertaken by the radical Muslim world, its far-left allies, some far-right allies, and the international media. The strategy is called baffling with bullshit. Here's how it works. First, you construct institutions that mirror your perspective so as to create an echo chamber. For example, you take over or create pseudo-human rights organizations dedicated to promoting the anti-Israel point of view. Then you trot them out routinely in order to claim that, despite all evidence, Israel is the real threat to human rights. So how can you tell which human rights organizations are biased and illegitimate? It's not that hard. If you're a human rights organization, presumably you should have had some pretty strong condemnation of Hamas's assault on Jews, the worst assault since the Holocaust, or Hamas's handling of the Gaza Strip, which is terroristic and fascistic. Here is a partial list of those who have been extraordinarily weak in their condemnations of Hamas or who have engaged in full-scale moral equivalence with Israel's defensive actions in Gaza. UNICEF chief Catherine Russell, Amnesty International, WHO chief Tedros Ghebreyesus, the International Committee of the Red Cross, UN Commissioner on Human Rights Volker Turk, the UN Relief and Works Agency, Save the Children, Doctors Without Borders, UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, the Open Society Foundations. The list of such organizations goes on and on and on.
One of the names that Ben mentioned there, Francesca Albanese, no relation to you-know-who, is the UN's Special Rapporteur, which literally means special talker on Palestine. And she's been in Australia of late. Why exactly? Well, she's made many media appearances, including ABC TV's Q&A, all over ABC Radio, and she was guest of honour at the Woke National Press Club lunch in Canberra a couple of weeks ago, where she made her views quite clear.
I wish to express my gratitude to the Australian Friends of Palestine and the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network for inviting me to Australia months ago, before the inferno that has enveloped Gaza started and or could be foreseen. And they invited me to meet with a variety of communities, constituencies, I'd say people of conscience, mostly, on unceded First Nations land. I pay tribute to the traditional custodians of the land where we are meeting today. And as a visitor to this country, but also as someone from the continent where colonialism originates, as a method of control, resource exploitation, and subjugation of the natives, it's particularly relevant for me to be here in my position as a special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory. And it is so moving for me to be able to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all other First Nations people present or watching. The indigenous people in these countries, as elsewhere across the world, cannot and have never ceded sovereignty. And as I say that, my heart goes out to Palestine, where the indigenous Palestinians, or what remains of them since the majority were ethnically cleansed in 1947, 1949 from what is modern-day Israel, and in 1967 from the territory that for 56 years Israel has militarily occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip.
Okay, well, her worldview and politics are crystal clear. Western civilization, colonialism, bad. Israel, bad. And she's very clearly lecturing us on our Indigenous politics here in Australia and likening our situation to the Israel-Palestine situation. Craziness. Nice thing for an Italian visiting our country to be so smug and sure about. And she's no person that's short on smug and sure. She's also telling us that she is certain that Palestinians, not the Jewish people, are the only Indigenous peoples of the Holy Land. Wow, she's smart. She solved all the problems of the world in her big lawyer brain. Just don't dare tell her that she might be wrong. She doesn't like that very much. That's the UN's Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese. So where is the UN's special talker for Israel? It was revealed this week that Francesca Albanese was brought to Australia by a number of Palestinian groups, fully funded. And there are big question marks now over whether that might be in breach of her United Nations mandate, that she's not allowed to actually take any funding for that United Nations role of being the special rapporteur for Palestine. Also, there's just an incredible gullibility on the part of the Australian media to think that she's somehow neutral or some expert because she's got United Nations in her title. She is a campaigner for Palestine, brought here by Palestinian lobby groups in order to push their agenda and their message. And the Australian media just completely fell for it. The National Press Club is in Canberra. You know the place. It's the woke, out-of-touch, elitist, big government-loving basket case of a national capital that we all know, following the Voice referendum, is completely out of step with the people of this country. They voted 39-61 in favour of the Voice. Everyone else voted 61-39 against it. So it's no wonder there were more woke-looking types wearing Palestinian-style scarves in that audience at the National Press Club lunch than you could poke a stick at. National Press Club lunches have audiences that are not only filled with journalists, but there are plenty of journalists in that crowd. I'm assuming and hoping that most of them were remaining somewhat neutral. We hope. I've often quoted the famous observation of the late US political and media influencer Andrew Breitbart that politics is downstream of culture. Politics is downstream of culture, which means that if we don't first fix our culture, that we will never fix our politics. We have to get leftist and woke ideology out of our universities, schools, media, entertainment, art and churches before we'll ever get it out of politics and government. A new report by the think tank, the IPA, finds that universities are indoctrinating trainee teachers in wokeness and political activism. The idea is nothing new, but the IPA did a comprehensive analysis of the content in every education faculty of the 37 Australian universities that offer teaching qualifications in 2023 and found that in a 4-year degree, the equivalent of just 10 weeks of classes are dedicated to the teaching of core literacy and numeracy skills. So what are they learning in that 4 years? Well, the study found that nearly 1/3 of all subjects offered to students studying a teaching degree relate to woke concepts and ideology. Teaching issues related to critical social justice theory. And fewer than 1 in 10 subjects are actually about literacy and numeracy. The effect of all this university failure is clear. The 2023 NAPLAN results show that 1 in 3 Australian students are not meeting basic standards of numeracy and literacy. And the latest OECD Program for International Student Assessment results showed that Australian classrooms ranked among the unruliest in the world, at 70th out of 77 countries surveyed. So the kids are out of control, which is probably why they're out marching in the streets for Palestine over an issue they probably know nothing about because they haven't been educated in any history. The IPA's Dr. Bella de Brera says, quote, the warped priorities of Australian university faculties are having a detrimental impact. Initial teacher training, notably woke and notoriously lacking in evidence-based preparation for the realities of the classroom, is leaving new teachers floundering and vulnerable. Our teachers and students deserve better. The Brownstone Institute is an American organisation set up by a group of scientists and academics in New York in 2021 to defend and promote the liberty and freedom that's essential for an enlightened society.
The Brownstone Institute is a non-profit organization founded May 2021. Its vision is of a society that places the highest value on the voluntary interaction of individuals and groups.
The Institute says it's about promoting the values of the Enlightenment that put the voluntary interaction between individuals and groups above systems of government control to produce the best outcomes. But they put learning, science, progress and universal rights to the forefront of public life, which are constantly under threat by ideologies and systems that would take the world back to the Dark Ages.
The motive force of Brownstone Institute was the global crisis created by policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. That trauma revealed a fundamental misunderstanding, a willingness on the part of the public and officials to relinquish freedom and fundamental human rights. The consequences were devastating and will live in infamy. The policy response was a failed experiment, and yet the lockdowns are also widely considered a template of what is possible. It's not just about this one crisis. The lesson concerns the desperate need for a new outlook that rejects the ability of the legally privileged few to rule over the many under any pretext.
The Brownstone Institute was founded by Professor Jeffrey Tucker, who in 2020 helped organise the Great Barrington Declaration, which advocated the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions. Professor Jay Bhattacharya and Sunetra Gupta, two of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, are also involved with the Brownstone Institute. The Institute held its annual conference a couple of weeks ago in Dallas, Texas, and the keynote speaker was someone you'll know if you watch ADH TV, Dr. Ramesh Thakur, a former United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Emeritus Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. And viewers of ADH and readers of The Spectator will know Dr. Thakur as a regular contributor. In a powerful speech there, he lashed the authorities in Australia and all around the world for their appalling overreach in the management of COVID.
If I have committed no crime and I'm a healthy person, who the hell are you, the government, my enemy, to put me under house arrest? You can stop me from seeing my family, my grandchildren. Get lost.
Dr. Thakur said unchecked medical tyranny seemed hell-bent on destroying Western societies of free peoples.
With the presumption we are all sick, whether we know it or not, or will soon be sick, and we must all be dealt with as potential germ-ridden disease carriers who pose a constant threat to all others. The compulsion and coercion never had any ethical justification, and decisions should never have been left to the self-appointed custodians of the science. Citizens have inalienable rights and freedoms. Governments have limited powers. Which part of this equation do governments not recognize? The unprecedented, no-limits intrusion of the state into the most intimate spaces of individual behavior and economic activity would have been unimaginable before COVID.
Dr. Thacker's entire thesis for his address at the Institute's annual gathering was that woke ideology, identity politics, neo-Marxism, whatever you want to call it, laid the bedrock for the COVID restrictions.
Individual human rights have been progressively subordinated to group-based collective and anti-discrimination laws. Public health, by definition, is a collective good. In the name of ensuring the safe health of everyone, governments trampled willy-nilly on previously inviolate individual rights. Most Western governments succumbed to the fatal conceit that one group of citizens has the right to use coercion to set their personal protection as an absolute value and to disregard the safety values balance of others.
Dr. Thacker says wokeism is a war on Western civilization. He says it attempts to make the state and the collective superior to the rights of the individual in cases where that is not justified. And that's really shifted our culture's way of thinking. And COVID was a test of how far we've let it take control of us and how willing we are to throw away centuries of hard-won rights to individual freedom and civil liberties. We failed that test.
Technocrats and experts insist they know best. Governments are brainwashed and intimidated into changing laws at the behest of shouty groups. These laws are then used to coerce citizens into compliance. Biologists and medical practitioners medical personnel became complicit in science denialism on gender self-ID through career-protecting silence. COVID policies gave them the opportunity to rinse and repeat. In other words, the rapid march of wokeism was met by and large with inertia, complacency, ideological confusion, and moral cum intellectual cowardice. Preconditioned into compliance with anti-scientific rubbish in order to show our caring side, we were ripe for pandemic-triggered biosecurity state.
The Australian National University Emeritus Professor then told the conference that the silencing and cancellation of any dissent, even from the medical community and expert epidemiologists themselves by the government-approved health authorities, was a key component of the approach.
Regulators threatened dissenting doctors with professional disciplinary action, and the threat was indeed carried out. All dissent is ruthlessly suppressed, and dissenting voices are silenced and cancelled. Yet, as we know, science is a work in progress, not an encyclopedia of facts. Although the long arc of science bends towards truth, progress is neither linear nor irreversible. Diversity viewpoints on contested elements of knowledge and rejection of attempts to suppress dissenting voices provide necessary safeguards against reverses of knowledge. If the infrastructure of the surveillance state and collusion of the censorship industrial complex had been available to authorities and gatekeepers of public morals and knowledge in previous eras, we would all still be flat earthers.
A scathing yet accurate attack on the appalling behaviour of our modern universities there. The former United Nations Assistant Secretary General then turned his attention to the failure of our bureaucrat class in properly assessing the extent of the risk of COVID and applying a balanced, not a hysterical, lopsided approach to its containment and management. that caused more problems and suffering than it prevented.
COVID-19 is not remotely as lethal as the Spanish flu. Our health systems and treatment options are infinitely better than a century ago. Yet authorities did not close down whole societies and economies in 1918. In other deadly pandemic episodes also, we suffered but endured. To militant woke activists, there seems to be no limit to the collateral harms that are accepted as mere roadkills on the highway to social justice heaven. Warnings of collateral harm of COVID interventions were dismissed as exaggerated, speculative, without evidence, etc. Yet evidence continues to mount on the many different pathways through which the Grim Reaper claims his growing mass of victims from the panicked responses to COVID. Ignoring the forest of safety signals flashing in bright neon lights, how many children will be sacrificed to vaccine harms before COVID vaccines are banned for healthy children and adolescents? How many poor children around the world missed out on life-saving immunization schedules? This is obviously an anti-vaxxer speaking. On life-saving immunization schedules and years of schooling because of lockdown restrictions that saved very few healthy young lives.
That's Dr. Ramesh Thakur, a former United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Emeritus Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. If you'd like to watch that speech in its entirety, and I highly recommend it, just search up the Brownstone Institute. A professor who was hounded out of his job at the prestigious University of London because he dared to stand up against woke bullying has warned we could be entering a kind of intellectual dark age, according to polling of young people about free speech. In an editorial for a UK newspaper, Professor Eric Kaufman says that in her recent first speech as the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford, Professor Irene Tracy referred to a survey from last year that found that while there may be strong agreement in the abstract that free speech should be protected in universities, only a paltry 20% of those who took part in the survey agreed that universities should allow all ideas and opinions to be expressed, even if some people might feel threatened as a result of them. The new Oxford University Vice-Chancellor wasn't bothered by this, however. Instead, she said that the research highlights, quote, one of the tasks we have, making sure that free speech happens within the bounds of civility, intellectual rigour and the law, unquote. Well, it sounds very nice, but when you stop and think about it for a minute, that's very scary stuff coming from the head of what many consider to be the world's top university. Professor Kaufman, a Canadian, says the pendulum has swung way too far already. He spent years battling woke forces within the University of London, where he'd worked for 20 years, only to lose. In his article, Professor Kaufman says that woke ideology has a way of generating phrases that send a shiver down the spine. And the most chilling is the phrase, the process is the punishment. The idea that merely being investigated for speaking out against hard left orthodoxy is itself a kind of torment. You don't have to be guilty of any professional misdemeanor, he writes. The accusation of a thought crime alone is sufficient to inflict anxiety and fear, silence opposition, and impose obedience. The process is the punishment. Professor Kaufman was subjected to 3 internal inquiries by the University of London, and he says that although a non-disclosure agreement prevents him from discussing them in any detail, they made his life intolerable. Professor Kaufman has since joined the University of Buckingham, the UK's oldest private university, where he's developed a new course which teaches students about the perils of woke culture. He spoke to ADH's Fred Paul in London recently and says the young people of today could usher in the end of our culture that's been built on Enlightenment values.
Essentially, the values of what I call cultural liberalism, free speech, equal treatment, objective truth, all of that is in danger, mainly because of the rise of a new generation that doesn't believe as strongly in those views and privileges other values, namely equal outcomes between identity groups, and also not psychologically harming or in the most microscopic way members of those groups. Those are more important values than those older value, Enlightenment values. And as they become the majority in the workforce and the voters, they have the capacity to overturn that long Enlightenment tradition.
Professor Kaufman calls it a shift from cultural liberalism to cultural socialism. The most defining difference being that liberalism puts the focus on equal opportunity, while socialism puts it on unequal opportunity to force equal outcomes.
I guess it's this shift from equal treatment but unequal outcomes to, unequal treatment to get equal outcomes, right? So you're using the same word, equality, but you're changing it from sort of a process and procedure to something that is an end in itself. And that is the shift that I call a shift from cultural liberalism to cultural socialism. And then we're in a period where cultural socialism becomes the dominant value in institutions and amongst young people. And that's kind of what we're fighting against.
Yeah, and cultural socialism is a race to the bottom. I can't remember who said it, but someone once said, if everyone is free, then they are not equal, and if everyone is equal, then they are not free.
Exactly, and so we're trading one set of values that emphasizes freedom as more important than equal outcomes to the other set of values that says if you've got any race gap, gender gap in incomes in anything, then we're going to have to re-engineer society, and we're going to have to restrict your freedom to speak, to get a job, to have meritocracy in order to achieve these targets, right? So that's the difference.
Professor Kaufman told Fred that the threat to free speech at our universities is coming not just from the top down.
On the one hand, you have the punishment apparatus, which is what I call a vertical from the institution, firing you, punishing you, whatever. But then you've also got, I think, arguably more important is the horizontal peer-to-peer ostracism, peer pressure, not hiring, not promoting, not publishing, etc. That is really bad. Yeah, essentially, you will not get published if you are taking a view that is, if you're gender critical and you try to hold a conference at a university, you will be known as the person who is that troublemaker, and people will sort of move away from you. You're kind of radioactive. That's that social dynamic of conformity, which is so important. Yeah, I think things are pretty bad. I mean, how bad are they? Probably 3 and 4 conservative social scientists in Australia, the UK, US, would self-censor in research, teaching, and discussions. 3/4. They share, and almost 70% are afraid of losing job or reputation.
Unbelievable. 3/4 are self-censoring, and over 70% are worried about losing their jobs or reputation. That is a problem. We need to stop mucking around here. We need to tie the funding of universities in Australia to metrics of diversity of worldview and perspective. Not diversity of anything else. Diversity of worldview and perspective, especially in the social sciences, which have just become echo chambers of groupthink. And that's all we have time for this week on The Other Side Australia. Please like and share and tell your friends about the show. We really do need your support, and that is the best way that you can support us and help keep the media landscape in Australia more diverse politically and have more diversity of opinion, the only diversity that should really matter. And join us on ADH TV at adh.tv on any web browser for all of our great content. We also stream live on YouTube. So you can check out our stream there at ADH TV, just search it up on YouTube. Alan Jones is on every Tuesday and Wednesday night. Alexandra Marshall, Daisy Cousins, Spectator TV, Nick Cater. And don't forget Fred Paul's excellent show every Monday night. It drops around 8 p.m. And also Professor David Flint. All the great content. And a lot of the speeches from the art conference in London recently are up there too. So check it out. You can download our app if you want to get real fancy to your phone. Just search up ADH TV on Google Play or the Apple App Store. It's a great app to watch on. and you can watch anytime you like on your phone, or you can watch our live stream, as I said, on YouTube at any time. There's heaps of ways to find ADH TV. Please tell your friends about us and please enjoy our content. We'll catch you next weekend for The Other Side Australia. We drop a new show every Friday night at 8 p.m. It's your weekly summary catch-up of all the week's news without the woke. I'm Damien Curry. Bye for now.